There's something about the night that sharpens our senses. When the world goes quiet and the lights go out, every little sound feels a little more threatening. Lying in bed, a creak in the hallway, or a thump on the floor can send your heart racing. Darkness has a way of making us feel exposed, like anything could be hiding in the shadows. But during the day, we let our guard down. Sunshine, neighbors mowing their lawns, kids playing outside, it all feels normal and safe. That's exactly what makes today's case so unsettling. It was a Monday afternoon in July. Leota, a mother of 3, was home with her kids doing the most ordinary of tasks, hanging laundry on the clothesline. But while she was outside, someone is believed to have slipped into her home and waited. What happened next shattered her family's world and left behind a mystery that's remained unsolved for decades. But there's still hope, because every year, cold cases are solved through advances in technology, and sometimes because someone finally speaks. I'm your host, Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved murder of Leota Camp. Today's episode comes from a listener request. It was suggested right after I released the episode of Elena Sanchez Hawkins, a young mother who was murdered in front of her small child in Elizabethtown, Kentucky back in the 1990s. This case shares some haunting similarities, and the more I looked into it, the more I felt compelled to tell the story. It's a case that's gone unanswered for decades, and it powerfully reinforces the heart of this podcast, that even the seemingly simple, idyllic life of the 1960s wasn't always as safe as it appeared to be. Leota Mae Hodges was born on January 20th, 1942, in the town of Kirksville, Missouri. The daughter of Fern and Forrest Hodges, Leota grew up on a farm in a religious family. Her husband would later recall that she had an incredible memory for Bible verses. As Leota was finishing school as a top honor student, she met her future husband, a man named Raymond Camp. Raymond worked for the Iowa Employment Security Commission as a tabulating equipment operator. And for those unfamiliar like myself, the tabulating machine was an electromechanical machine designed to assist in summarizing information stored on punch cards. So it was heavily used in things like accounting and bookkeeping. And despite that technology growing obsolete in the 1970s, Raymond was always into finding cutting-edge solutions to things and went on to have an incredibly successful career throughout the course of his life. But during this time frame, it was still his humble beginnings of his career, and he was working his way up. After getting married, Raymond and Leota settled into a home at 3212 Fleming Avenue in Des Moines, Iowa. In 1967, Des Moines was a mid-sized city of just under 200,000 people, and it was a steadily growing city of the American Midwest. It's the capital of Iowa, and it served as a political and economic hub, especially known for their insurance industry, publishing, and of course, in the Midwest, agriculture. Culturally at the time, it reflected many of the broader trends of the 1960s in America. It was a mix of traditional values with the beginnings of social change. The neighborhood that Leota and Raymond lived in was quiet and working class. These were small, single-story homes close together, and I'll have a picture of the modern-day view of the street on my Instagram at SimplerTimeCrimePod. Leota was a mom and a housewife, and her street was filled with women doing the exact same thing. In July of '67, the Camps had 3 children, and their ages were as follows. Kevin was 4, Brenda was 3, and baby Christine was 3 months old. Monday, July 10th, 1967, was an ordinary day. Raymond kissed his wife goodbye and headed off to work. It had rained overnight, but as the day went on, the sun was shining and it was a hot 80 degrees outside. Leota wanted to use the weather to her advantage, and so after she washed some laundry, she wanted to hang clothes and the cloth baby diapers on the family clothesline in the backyard. Kevin and Brenda were living their best childhood summer lives that day. They were playing outside, running around, just enjoying the sunshine, as preschoolers do. And they were outside in that backyard space where their mother was hanging up the laundry, and their baby sister was inside. After she was done hanging the laundry, Leota went inside to make a bottle for the baby and just tend to the newborn, while the other kids still played outside. At around noon, the 2 older kids, their stomachs began to rumble, and they decided to head in for lunch. When they walked inside, they saw their baby sister nursing a warm bottle on a white blanket laid out on the floor of the living room, but they didn't see their mother, so they went looking for her. Walking into the front bedroom, they stumbled into a horrifying scene. Their mother, tied up on the bed and covered in blood. 4-year-old Kevin actually pulled a knife out of his mother's back, hoping to help, but the sibling duo quickly realized they needed adult help, so they ran out of the house screaming. They sprinted next door to their neighbor, Mrs. Mary Grow. They exclaimed, "Mommy's bleeding." She followed the kids back to the camp home, and I'm not sure what she was expecting, but I'm almost certain it wasn't the scene she walked into. Panicked and horrified, she ran to another neighbor's, Mrs. Nell Edwards. The pair of women returned to the home with the children and found Leota moaning and clinging to life. Leota had her hands and feet bound with neckties and another necktie in her mouth as a gag. They removed the gag from her mouth and they called for an ambulance and police. Despite still being alive at this time, Leota couldn't speak and wasn't able to tell them anything about who did this to her. Leota Camp lived just 2 miles from Broadlawns Polk County Hospital, but despite the first responders doing everything they could, Leota was pronounced dead on arrival to the hospital at 12:30 p.m. Raymond Camp was at work when he received a call from Mary Grow's husband that an incident had happened with Leota and that he needed to get to the hospital. He rushed off and was met with the unimaginable. I can't even picture what this must have been like for Raymond and for Kevin and Brenda. Seeing their mother like that and trying to process it through the mind of a preschooler, it's just unfathomable. Des Moines Police Detective Chief Cletus Leeming was lead on this case, and he put tons of resources together to investigate. And first they had to get a sense of the crime scene and the injuries that Leota sustained. Leota had been stabbed 4 times in the back by 2 different knives, and those knives were taken from a rack hanging in her kitchen, and they were part of a set. The 6-inch bladed knife was found beside her on the bed, and this is the one that Kevin had pulled out of her when he came into the bedroom. On the floor nearby was a 4-inch blade, but the handle had broken off of that one, and the handle was nowhere to be found. A reporter for the Des Moines Tribune asked Detective Chief Cletus Leeming if the killer had stabbed Leota, broken the knife, and then went to retrieve the second knife. He replied, quote, "If I was assuming, that would be my assumption, but I'm not going to. I'm trying to give you facts," end quote. Chief Leeming would not comment on if there were any fingerprints found on the murder weapon or throughout the house. I also mentioned that Leota had been bound and gagged with neckties. Those were Raymond's neckties, so the killer had used items that he found in the house, not anything he had brought with him. As far as the state of the house, there did not appear to be any signs of a struggle or any defensive wounds found on Leota. There was also nothing notably missing or taken from the home, and there were no signs of forced entry. Leota had on all of her clothes, and it was found that she was not sexually assaulted. The Polk County medical examiner at the time was a man named Dr. Leo D. Luca, and he had a bit of a hunch about the type of killer they might be looking for. Remember, this is 1967, and the Behavioral Sciences Unit of the FBI wasn't formed until 1972, so investigators in cases during this time couldn't call up the FBI like they can now and say, hey, this is the situation, can you review this case and tell us the type of killer you think we're looking for? So there was more amateur profiling done, and it wasn't even called that yet. But Dr. Luca stated that he felt that the perpetrator of this crime was, quote, a kook or a pervert who got scared and panicked, end quote. He went on to say that it was his belief that the killer entered the front of the home while Mrs. Camp was in the backyard with her older children, and that she came inside sooner than he expected, and he panicked and killed her. And that he likely threatened to harm baby Christine if she screamed or fought him at all. I think that last part makes a lot of sense. We saw the same thing in the Elena Sanchez Hawkins case. Her house was in perfect order, and she showed no signs of a struggle. Parents will do just about anything to protect their children, and I personally believe that in both Elena's case and Leota's, that is what happened. Having said that, I personally feel less inclined to believe that this was someone who got surprised sooner than expected or just panicked. This was a very small window of time, and when he walked in, he would have seen the baby there. A mom isn't going to leave her infant child unattended for long, so I have a hard time believing he would have been suddenly surprised by Leota walking in. If he was, you'd think he'd just flee, but he was very calculated, he tied her up, he stabbed her. Something that does seem relevant is that the killer used items found in the camp home and didn't bring any himself. You're probably also wondering, did anybody see anything? And that answer is yes. By Tuesday, the day after the murder, police had released information on a vehicle and a suspect description. This is a working class neighborhood, a lot of people home and out and about, and more than one witness claimed to see a man walk diagonally across the camp lawn towards the front of the home and then later exit rather quickly and get into a black vehicle and drive off. I'll have a picture of the composite sketch on our Instagram. A lot of the descriptions of this guy was that he was a pretty good-looking man. He was white but had a tan, and that he was around 20 years old or in his 20s, about 5'8" to 5'9", with a somewhat stocky build, with dark wavy hair, and he was wearing a plaid shirt and dark pants. The car also had a distinct look. It was thought to be either a 1965 or 1966 Ford Mustang fastback model with a sloping back window and louvers. By Wednesday, it was reported in the paper that police had fielded over 300 calls with tips on the case and witness accounts and directions they should go in. They had 6 full-time detectives working the case and many more doing so part-time. Detectives attended her funeral on Thursday, July 13th, looking for anybody who might match the description. They also took this time to talk to people from Leota's hometown in Missouri, hoping to see if there was any connection there, but they came up empty on all fronts. Leota didn't have any enemies, and nobody could think of anyone who would want to harm the young mother. But on Friday, July 14th, Raymond Camp came forward and did share of something alarming that had happened recently. I want to thank you all so much for tuning into this week's episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. Thanks to all of you sharing the show and getting the word out there. I now have listeners in all 50 U.S. states and nearly 50 countries worldwide. I want to keep that momentum going so that more people can hear about these older unsolved cases and get them the much needed attention. You can help by leaving a review and subscribing or following the show on your preferred listening platform. While I've only covered US cases up to this point, I have thought about expanding into other countries as well, especially with a growing audience in certain places like Australia, Ireland, Canada, and the UK. So if you have a local case that's at least 20 years old and unsolved and you think I should cover it, send me an email at simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. I welcome partnering with families in compassionate and purpose-driven, actionable storytelling as well, so feel free to pass my name along. Thanks again, and now back to the show. According to reporting by Nick Lamberto for the Des Moines Register, Raymond Camp recalled how his wife had received an obscene phone call a few weeks before her murder. In his memory, it was about 1.5 to 2 weeks prior to the 4th of July. Leota was home during the day with her children when the call occurred. She said she had been feeding the baby when the phone rang several times, so she set the baby down to go answer the phone. When she answered, she heard a man's voice say, "Where you been?" She said the tone of the voice was strange, but she thought maybe it was one of their friends teasing her, so she just said, "I've been feeding the baby." And the man replied, "I thought maybe you were..." And then he apparently said some sort of obscene expression that Raymond Camp wouldn't even repeat over the phone to this reporter. My assumption is it was something sexual in nature. She immediately hung up the phone and was understandably freaked out enough that she called Raymond at work to discuss the call. Their number was not published in the phone book, so they both decided at that time that some crazy person must have just dialed a number and landed on it, and they were confident in that because no more calls came after that. But now he wasn't so sure. Raymond Camp and his children moved into a trailer on the property of Leota Camp's sister Donna, and Donna helped care for the children as Raymond navigated providing for and raising 3 small children as a widower. There were actually articles in the paper where he had to get all this special zoning permission to put a trailer on the property, and he had to kind of say, "Look, I don't think my kids should grow up in the home they found their mother murdered in, but I can't afford anything else right now." And even though there were some uppity, towny people worried about the trailer setting a precedent to others, a board member chimed in and said, "Look, if ever there was a case for a hardship exemption, this is the case." And so the zoning permit was granted. Raymond Camp scraped together $2,500 for a reward. But despite the money and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of leads, the case went nowhere. Time passed, and Raymond Camp got remarried and tried to give his kids as normal of a life as possible. And Leota's case somewhat went cold. That was until 1973, when another woman was murdered, and the case had quite a few similarities. On October 22, 1973, a 21-year-old woman named Mary Sen was found stabbed to death in her Des Moines duplex. Mary lived in a different part of town from Leota, about a 10-minute drive away. In Mary's case, she had left her home to go to the market, and police believe that the person had then snuck inside and was waiting for her. There's mixed reporting on the case. Some articles say that nothing was taken from the home, and some do talk about a small amount of cash missing. The phone lines had been cut. Mary was not sexually assaulted, and she was still fully clothed. She had been stabbed twice in the abdomen and once in the neck. Mary was found by her husband. He had tried calling the home around the time of the attack, and this was around 6 p.m., and that's when they estimate it had taken place. He was calling to say he was ready to be picked up from work because they shared a car, but the phone just kept ringing. When she didn't arrive to pick him up, he took a taxi home, and then he discovered his wife. Police once again had difficulty with motive on this case because there was potentially some money missing, and once that came out, they just sort of took that and ran and said, "I bet she was just interrupting a burglary. He didn't expect her to get home this quickly, and it turned sour. I struggle to believe that to be the case, because if you're burglarizing a place to steal a few bucks, you don't cut the phone lines, especially if you don't think there's anybody there. The reason you cut phone lines is you want someone to not be able to call for help. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. This felt targeted, and it had a lot of overlaps with Leota's case. This was a young woman murdered in her home while her husband was at work. She was fully clothed, she was stabbed to death, and she had not been sexually assaulted. The person had seemingly snuck in while she was briefly out of the home. But there were a few differences. In this case, Mary didn't have a child around to be used as leverage. There were signs of a small struggle, though it appeared that if Mary had tried to fight back, she was overpowered pretty quickly, to the point where some sources don't note signs of a struggle at all. And in Mary's case, there was no murder weapon found. In Leota's case, there were no phone lines cut. So, as you can see, some similarities and some differences. Mary's case went cold quickly, despite a large-scale manhunt, and her case also remains unsolved to this day. Around this time, in late 1973 to 1974, Des Moines police began to put out to the media that they were just having issues with prowlers, even going as far to say as they were going to initiate a war on prowlers. They were stepping up their patrols and trying different techniques to catch these criminals. Now, I don't know about you, but when I hear prowler, I think more about people who are peeping Toms, hiding out in the bushes, that type of thing. So I was surprised when I read that they were talking more about burglars in this scenario. In 1974, the chief of police in Des Moines was a man named Wendell Nichols, and he felt very strongly about this issue. He said to the Des Moines Register, quote, "We're sick and tired of these prowlers. We're declaring a war on them, using our tactical unit extensively on this problem. We also plan to have the police helicopter flying patrol in residential areas. Night prowls are dangerous enough, but daytime ones are even worse. Any daylight house prowler is a potential killer. There's a 50-50 chance such a prowler is a hophead, on dope and looking for something to cash in to buy drugs. 2 of our unsolved murders can be attributed to daytime prowlers, probably surprised in the act by the housewife," end quote. And the 2 women that he mentioned in the article are Mary Senn and Leota Camp. I know hindsight is 20/20, and I don't have access to the police files that they do, but Mary and Leota's cases just seem different in nature. He gave examples of other cases. There was a waitress who was awoken in the middle of the night to intruders, but once she was up, she startled them off and they just took money and left. There was another where burglars broke into a house and suddenly said, "Wait, someone's here," and then they just fled. And that's a much, much different scenario and a much different outcome than what Mary and Leota experienced. Chief Wendell Nichols went on to say, quote, "I am strongly opposed to probation, parole, or deferred sentences for house prowlers. I have the word of the county attorney, Ray Fenton, that he agrees with me on this. Of course, the county attorney can make recommendations, but he can't tell the courts what to do. Prowlers are just scaring the hell out of people, and it's getting so they don't travel alone, but in pairs or threes. One woman chased a prowler and he pointed a gun at her and told her he would shoot her if she didn't go back in her room. Another bad feature is that many of these prowlers are juveniles, but even so, you can't just turn them loose and tell them not to do it again. Sometimes they're turned loose because it's their first offense. That's wrong. I don't buy that. Usually it's just the first time they're caught. But we have a problem with these bold prowlers. We're going to zero in on them and the fences where they sell stuff they steal. TV sets, cameras, stereos. The property loss from prowlers is bad enough, but we sure don't want any more killings from them. I repeat, every prowler is a potential killer." Time marched on. Years turned into decades, and Leota's case stayed ice cold, though forever in the minds of those who loved her. Leota's daughter Brenda was interviewed in 2015. You'll remember that Brenda was 3 years old at the time of her mother's murder and was one of the two who found her. In her interview, Brenda discussed how the loss of her mother in such a brutal way affected her over the years. It wasn't discussed too much when she was growing up, but nevertheless, she lost her innocence and recognized evil in the world from a young age, when most kids don't even know it exists yet. Brenda said she really started to feel the impact when she reached the age her mother was when she died, and when she had children of her own. She always thought about reaching out to law enforcement and checking on the case file, but it wasn't until she got into her 50s that she decided to really look into it. And she has been a big point person on it ever since. Brenda has collaborated closely with iowacoldcases.org to provide pictures and case facts and discussion and make sure her mother's case stays out there. iowacoldcases.org is not only a great website, it's actually a nonprofit organization as well and a great resource for any Iowa cases. It includes Wilma June Nissen, who I also covered on this show. This website will be linked in the show notes. Around the same time in 2014 to 2015, one of the people who commented on the Iowa Cold Case website, well, he lists his full name on the website. I don't know if he wants it named on this podcast or not, so I'm just going to call him by his first name, which is Adam. He's a psychiatrist out of Maryland, and he studied one particular criminal very closely, and Adam is absolutely convinced that he knows that this person killed Leota Camp. And the suspect he names is a man named James DeBartoleben. And he was one messed up guy, but strangely enough, his undoing wasn't because of a violent crime. You see, the Secret Service had been tracking him for years. They didn't know his identity. He was known to them as the Mall Passer. The Secret Service was not created just to protect the president. The Secret Service was actually formed to tackle a huge issue of counterfeiting operations because the U.S. found that there was a substantial problem with this at the time. And from 1979 to 1983, there was someone traveling all over the U.S. with counterfeit bills that they presumed this person was creating as well. And he was primarily going into shopping malls to use these bills, which is how he got his name. He would buy a super low price item, think of like a $1 item, hand a counterfeit $20 bill over to the cashier, and then in each of those instances, he was making $19 or so profit. They were estimating that this person was pulling in over $120,000 a year with this scheme. The Secret Service had begun to close in on him, and they had a composite of what he looked like, and what happened was a store clerk in a Tennessee mall saw him come in, had a picture nearby of what he looked like, and was on the lookout, and she called security, and he was caught. At this point, he was facing serious felony charges for passing counterfeit money, but they were trying to find out how he was printing it so they could charge him with producing it, which carries a much bigger sentence. And they ended up finding a storage unit that he had rented, and in it they found the machine he was using to make the money, and then they found so much more than that. In his storage unit were photographs of women being sexually assaulted. There was what was determined to be a kill kit, including handcuffs, shoelaces, chains, whips, and KY jelly. There was also homemade audio tapes of rape and torture of various women, and several sets of women's underwear. There were also tons of notebooks and cassette tapes where he documented sexual assaults and attacks of women and his plans on how he wanted to escalate over time. DeBartoleben is unique in that he wasn't a person who bragged about all his crimes, and so the FBI believes that he has so many more victims all over the country than what he's actually been connected to. There were a couple of women whom he lured into his vehicle with a fake police light when he was impersonating a police officer. He then would kidnap them, sexually assault them, torture them, and release them. In 1980, He is suspected of brazenly abducting a retail store clerk from a store, bringing her back to his residence, brutalizing her, repeatedly sexually assaulting her, and then letting her go. And he also has ties to a number of real estate agent murders across the country. In June of 1971, a 52-year-old realtor named Edna McDonald left her office for an evening appointment in Barrington, Rhode Island. She believed she was meeting a man who had identified himself as Mr. Peter Morgan. The next day, Edna was found dead, hanging from a rafter in the basement of the very home she had been showing. There were no signs of a robbery or sexual assault. Instead, investigators discovered she had been strangled by her own stockings. In April of 1979, a 31-year-old realtor named Elizabeth Mason agreed to show a prospective buyer several homes in Fayetteville, North Carolina. But during one of those showings, everything took a violent turn. The man pulled out a gun and began pistol whipping her inside the house. He slammed her head into the floor, tied her up, and strangled her until she lost consciousness. When Elizabeth came to, her car and underwear were gone, but she hadn't been sexually assaulted despite being partially undressed. It was a brutal and calculated attack, and one that left investigators with more questions than answers. Interestingly enough, I came across his name when I did my last episode on the abductions of Arilla Vall and Dodie Gay from Bossier City in Louisiana. That's because in the years around their disappearances, a realtor was murdered in Bossier City. On April 27, 1982, 37-year-old Jean McFall, a well-known and respected realtor in Bossier City, Louisiana, vanished after heading out to show a property to a man who called himself Dr. Zach. The next morning, Jean was found dead, hanging from a rafter in the attic of the home she'd been showing. She hadn't been raped, but she was brutally stabbed twice in the chest and strangled. A neighbor had seen the man known as Dr. Zach arrive at the house and was able to provide enough detail for police to create a composite sketch, one that bore a striking resemblance to de Bartoleben. It would later be found in de Bartoleben's personal diary that he had a list of aliases he intended to use during his crimes, and one of them was Dr. Zach. De Bartoleben was charged with both Jean McFall and Edna McDonald's murders, but he never went to trial for them. There were various reasons listed, but essentially they deemed it unnecessary because he was already found guilty in so many charges for his counterfeit scheme and the other assaults, and he was already facing over 300 years in jail without the possibility of parole. Still, this was very upsetting to Jean McFall's daughter, understandably, because she never felt like she had her day in court with him, and she thought that he never had to answer for her mother's murder. So he did spend the rest of his life in prison, and he died at age 70 in 2011. So how does he tie back to Leota? Well, for starters, there has been a lot of media coverage of his violent crime spree, as well as a book written titled Lethal Shadow, The Chilling True Crime Story of a Sadistic Sex Slayer by Stephen Michaud. And through all the research, it's found that de Bartoleben used many nicknames and was known to have been in the Des Moines area around the time of the murder. He was known to make phone calls similar to the one Leota Camp received before her murder. And by looking at his other crimes, even though so many are centered around sexual violence, there are cases he is tied to where there was murder with no sexual assault. And of course, there is the psychological characteristic of some killers that they find that act of stabbing to be sexual in nature. The police in Des Moines have never officially named him as a suspect, but there are certainly people who feel strongly he did it. And he does look like the composite sketch. But the Des Moines police have never named anyone as a suspect. There was one other case in the area that could point to de Bartoleben operating in that area. In 1969, a real estate agent named Dorothy Miller was murdered in a vacant home in Des Moines County, Iowa. She was showing the home to a man who went by the name Robert Clark. Her husband had actually met the suspect because he went with her to that first showing. And when nothing went awry that first time and Robert Clark wanted a follow-up showing, Dorothy's husband couldn't join that second time, but neither of them thought too much of it because everything went fine that first time. But this time, she was attacked, sexually assaulted, and stabbed over 20 times. Because he had been seen, there was a good composite sketch of him, and he looks very, very similar to DeBar de Laban. And it would fit his real estate agent targeting MO. But that case has never been officially tied to him, and Dorothy's case is another one of Iowa's cold cases. There is one other theory I haven't told you about, but it's not been very heavily weighted by law enforcement. But since it was mentioned by the Des Moines Register, I figured I'd share it. Years later, a woman named Carol came forward and spoke to the Des Moines Register, claiming she believed it was she, not Leota, that may have been the intended target that day. Back in 1967, Carol lived just a few houses down from the Camp family. She recalled seeing a black Mustang parked on the street as she left to run errands, the same day Leota was killed. Carol told the paper she had long felt her life might have been in danger. She speculated that someone could have hired a hitman to kill her, and that the killer may have simply gone to the wrong house. She didn't share why she believed someone would want her dead, only that the possibility had haunted her ever since. So again, take that for what you will. I've certainly encountered people, and even discussed on here, people who have had what we might call premonitions that something bad was going to happen to them. So I don't want to seem like I'm writing her off. I just also can't substantiate it in any way. And Carol has since passed away, so she isn't here for me to ask about it. The last little bit I'll point out, and I want to be clear, this is like Reddit commentary, database commenting, nothing I can verify, but there was one commenter who said they were about 10 years old when this happened and grew up in the neighborhood, and they recalled that many of the mothers in the neighborhood were getting these obscene phone calls. If that's true, that makes me wonder about somebody who knew these women, because as Raymond said, their number wasn't listed in the phone book, and I can't imagine they were the only family who went unlisted. So in that case, I would think that would have to be someone who had access to a personal address and phone number, like a Rolodex that someone had. That's just my thoughts. Leota's children have grown up and created amazing lives for themselves, with Brenda spearheading a lot of the advocacy and keeping her mother's case alive. Raymond Camp would later recall that he first drank his grief away, but then realized that wasn't benefiting him or his children, so he instead poured himself into his career, his new marriage, and his children. And Raymond had an incredibly successful career. He was recognized for creating the nation's first real-time system for determining unemployment insurance eligibility. His commitment to innovation continued during his time at the Iowa Department of Human Services, where he led the development and implementation of forward-thinking solutions. Ray earned the respect of colleagues across the country and went on to serve as president of the American Public Welfare Association in 1993. And then in 1995, he shifted to the private sector, working for Lockheed Martin, and he quickly added value to the emerging electronic payment services industry that was developing, and he ended up developing, marketing, and operating a payment card solution for government assistance programs. Think food stamps, childcare, WIC. And the whole point of him doing this was to reduce the stigma of utilizing public assistance, because he created what looked like a debit card like the general public uses rather than having to use paper coupons. So all of that is in thanks to Mr. Camp. Raymond passed away just last June, never having answers in his wife's violent murder. Each year, crimes that are 50 or more years old are getting solved, and Leota's family is patiently waiting for their turn. If you have any information about the unsolved murder of Leota Camp, please contact the Des Moines Police Department at 515-283-4646. 4864 or the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation at 515-725-6010. You can also email at dciinfo@dps.state.ia.us. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please spread the word about the podcast and share it on social media or with a friend. Case suggestions can be made to simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. Besides the Instagram page, I'm also on TikTok, Facebook, and all episodes are distributed to YouTube. Thank you so much for listening, and tune in next Monday.